In March 2026, food stopped shipping and started flying. Prices surged as much as 120%. The headlines called it a supply crisis. It wasn't. It was the visible symptom of something far more structural. The moment when Iran, Russia, and China began operating a parallel economic system that no longer required the dollar to function. On April 27, 2026, Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi landed in Moscow. To most observers, it was a diplomatic courtesy call. To anyone paying attention to the architecture being assembled beneath the surface of global trade, it was a signal, and a consequential one. This is not a story about Iran's nuclear ambitions or the geopolitics of the Persian Gulf in isolation. It is a story about what happens when the nations that control the world's energy supplies, its shipping lanes, and its raw material reserves decide collectively that they no longer need the system the United States built after World War II. To understand why that signal matters, you need to understand a piece of infrastructure that most people have never heard of. The missing link that wasn't missing anymore. The International North-South Transport Corridor, the INSTC, stretches 7,200 kilometers from Russian ports on the Baltic and Caspian Seas through Iranian territory all the way to Indian ports on the Arabian Sea. A cargo shipment that traditionally takes 6 weeks through the Suez Canal and around the Arabian Peninsula can move this corridor in 18 to 21 days. That is a 40% reduction in transit time and a cost savings of up to 30%. For years, the corridor remained largely theoretical. The reason was a single unfinished section, a 160-kilometer stretch of railway between Rasht and Astara in northern Iran. 160 kilometers, shorter than the drive from New York to Philadelphia, and was enough to keep a transcontinental trade corridor on paper rather than in operation. In April 2026, Russia and Iran signed the final executive agreement to complete it. The cost, 1.6 billion euros, split between Moscow and Tehran. Construction has begun. When that rail line is finished, Iran becomes the indispensable land bridge connecting 3 of the world's largest economies, Russia, India, and China, to the Indian Ocean. Goods, energy, and raw materials will flow overland through territory that no navy can blockade and no aircraft carrier can interdict. When the Houthi attacks of 2024 cut Suez Canal traffic by 57%, global shipping scrambled for alternatives. When the Strait of Hormuz becomes contested, as it is now, the INSTC simply keeps moving. Trains are indifferent to naval superiority. The trade numbers already reflect this transformation. Russia-India bilateral trade reached $68.7 billion in the 2024-2025 fiscal year, 5 times what it was in 2021. More striking is how that trade is settled. Up to 96% of financial transactions between Moscow and New Delhi now occur in rubles and rupees, not dollars, and not through SWIFT. Sanctions did not isolate Russia. Sanctions gave Russia and Iran the business case to build what they had been discussing for decades. The arc of pressure. Pull back further and a larger pattern becomes visible. Look at a map from the Arctic to the Persian Gulf. In the north, Russia has invited China to share access to its Arctic coastline, the longest effective Arctic shore of any nation, as melting ice opens new commercial shipping lanes. Move south to the Baltic, where drone attacks on Russian territory have been traced to or transited through NATO member states. Continue to Ukraine, where internal polling suggests somewhere between 60 and 80% of the population wants the war to end, a figure rarely reflected in Western coverage. Further south through the Caucasus, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and finally to Iran and the Strait of Hormuz at the bottom of the arc. These are not separate crises. They form a single, continuous pressure front running from the Arctic to the Arabian Sea. And at the far end of that front sits China. China imports 11.1 million barrels of oil every single day, making it the world's largest crude importer. Approximately 37.7% of that oil, roughly 5.4 million barrels daily, passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran alone supplies around 13% of China's total needs, sold at discounted prices under a 25-year strategic partnership signed in 2021. When the United States strikes Iranian infrastructure, it is not only hitting Iran, it is constricting the energy artery feeding the world's second-largest economy. But China saw this coming and spent years building an insurance policy. By early 2026, its strategic petroleum reserves reached between 1.2 and 1.4 billion barrels, enough for 108 to 130 days of full autonomy, even if every maritime route were cut simultaneously. No other country on Earth has that buffer. Japan holds roughly 230 days of reserves, but at far lower total volume. South Korea holds around 110 days. India holds 10. China also built pipelines. The ESPO pipeline from Russia, networks through Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, a strategic transoceanic pipeline through Myanmar from the port of Kyaukphyu to Yunnan province, carrying 70,000 barrels per day while bypassing the Strait of Malacca entirely. These are continental supply lines. Submarines cannot interdict a pipeline running through mountain ranges. The mathematics of modern warfare. Operation Epic Fury began in February 2026. In the first 12 hours, U.S. and Israeli forces struck 13,000 targets across Iranian territory. Command posts, air defenses, IRGC bases, nuclear facilities. The Pentagon reported the destruction of 150 Iranian naval vessels and claimed that 97% of Iran's sea mine stockpiles had been eliminated. 13,000 targets in 12 hours is not a military operation. It is a statement. The statement was, "This will be over before you know it." It wasn't. Iran's armed forces include approximately 610,000 active personnel, with 190,000 serving in the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, who control the missile program. The country's population is 89 million. Iran is vast, and it had been preparing for exactly this scenario for 40 years. Within days, Iran struck back. According to independent analysis and reporting by NBC News, Iranian forces successfully hit more than 100 targets across 11 U.S. military bases in the Middle East. The 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain was struck. The runway at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar was destroyed. Bases in Kuwait, the UAE, and Iraq were targeted. An Iranian F-5 fighter jet managed to strike Camp Buehring in Kuwait despite active air defense systems. THAAD radar systems worth more than $1 billion each were damaged by drones that cost less than a used car. The arithmetic here is impossible to ignore. An Iranian Shahed drone cost between $20,000 and $50,000 to produce. A single Patriot interceptor missile costs approximately $4 million. A THAAD interceptor runs between $12 and $15 million. The cost ratio between offense and defense reaches 1 to 300 at minimum, and in some engagements considerably higher. Iran can manufacture drones on assembly lines. The United States cannot manufacture THAAD interceptors on assembly lines. The production cycle for advanced interceptors takes years. This is not only a military conflict, it is a war of financial exhaustion, and the clock runs in Iran's favor. Official U.S. casualties from Epic Fury stand at 13 killed and over 365 wounded, figures that members of Congress and independent observers have openly accused the Pentagon of understating. Private satellite companies have reportedly been discouraged from publishing imagery of damaged installations. Meanwhile, Iran laid sea mines in the Strait of Hormuz before U.S. forces could prevent it. According to classified Pentagon estimates presented to Congress, full mine clearance will require at least 6 months after hostilities cease entirely. The strait is not merely contested, it is physically dangerous to transit. What Washington actually wants. Reading the language coming out of Washington carefully, a clear picture emerges. The administration is looking for something functionally equivalent to the Obama-era JCPOA nuclear agreement, but packaged in the language of a decisive Trump-era victory. The demand to eliminate Iran's ballistic missile program has been quietly dropped. Other preconditions once described as non-negotiable have similarly receded. What remains is a nuclear framework that can be held up to cameras and presented as a better deal than Obama achieved. Perhaps Iran ships its highly enriched uranium to Russia for safekeeping. Perhaps additional IAEA inspection protocols are added. The specific substance matters less than the optics. The political reality is straightforward. The 2026 midterm elections are approaching. Virginia's redistricting vote delivered a warning. Polls are moving against the administration broadly. By September, if the crisis remains unresolved, the energy shock alone could transform a recession into something structurally worse. America needs a spectacular victory to display. Iran only needs to not lose. That asymmetry shapes everything that follows. The Iranians and their diplomatic performance alone demonstrates considerable strategic sophistication, will almost certainly detect precisely what Washington requires and find a way to provide it without conceding anything of real strategic value. They will agree to a deal that allows the U.S. president to stand at a podium and declare triumph. The strait will reopen. Oil will flow. The world will move to the next crisis. But the world that emerges from that deal will bear little resemblance to the one that existed before the bombs fell in February 2026. The proof of concept. What happened at Hormuz is not an isolated event. It is a demonstration, a proof of concept for what 21st century conflict actually looks like. Not armies clashing on open fields or fleets engaging in deep ocean engagements. Instead, choke points, bottlenecks, narrow straits where 3 kilometers of contested water control 20% of the world's energy supply. Tiny islands where 92% of the world's advanced semiconductors are fabricated. Payment rails where the currency of denomination determines who holds power and who is subject to it. The economic modeling for various disruption scenarios is not speculative. It is arithmetic based on known reserves and known consumption rates. 7 days of Hormuz disruption produces panic pricing on futures markets, with spot prices surging to $100, $110 per barrel. 14 days breaks LNG delivery schedules across Asia as the market recognizes that no quick resolution is coming, driving oil to $120, $130, while energy-intensive industries in Japan and South Korea begin precautionary shutdowns. 30 days produces physical, unrecoverable diesel and fuel oil deficits across Europe and Asia, prices breaching $150, and the beginning of a global recessionary spiral with double-digit inflation returning. Unlike the Red Sea disruption, there is no rerouting around the Strait of Hormuz. The backup pipeline capacity, Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline and the UAE's ADCO pipeline to Fujairah, handles at most 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day combined. Add Iran's Gorey-Jask pipeline at 300,000 barrels. That still leaves 14 to 15 million barrels per day stranded with nowhere to go. Here is what makes this specifically a proxy engagement targeting China. 84% of the oil and 83% of the LNG transiting Hormuz is bound for Asian markets, not Europe, not North America. American dependence on Hormuz has fallen to between 2.5 and 7% of total U.S. oil imports. Europe imports roughly 600,000 barrels. The pain is structurally designed for Asia. The new architecture, Iran's transit toll system, approximately $1 per barrel of cargo through the strait, roughly $2 million per VLCC supertanker passage, up to $800 million per month when LNG carriers are included, may or may not survive negotiations in its current form. What cannot be disputed is that the precedent now exists. A sovereign state has demonstrated the ability to charge rent on one of the world's most critical trade corridors and denominate that rent in currencies the United States cannot freeze, seize, or sanction Chinese yuan through the CIPS system and digital assets outside U.S. jurisdiction. Every transaction is a micro-erosion of the dollar's monopoly on energy trade. The expanded BRICS bloc, now including Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the UAE, and Indonesia, accounts for roughly 40 to 41% of global GDP measured by purchasing power parity, exceeding the combined share of the G7. BRICS encompasses over 56% of the world's population and controls enormous reserves of energy, minerals, and industrial capacity. The next BRICS summit, scheduled for India in 2026 under Prime Minister Modi's chairmanship, carries an official theme of resilience, innovation, and cooperation. The unofficial agenda is more consequential: mechanisms for bypassing the dollar, blockchain-based payment systems immune to U.S. Treasury sanctions, and potentially a new trade settlement unit backed by gold and commodity baskets. India's own position illustrates precisely how the new world functions. With only 10 days of strategic petroleum reserves and 14.7% of its energy imports passing through Hormuz, India is catastrophically vulnerable to any disruption. Its response is not to choose sides, but to balance with ruthless precision. India maintains its technology and investment partnership with the United States as a counterweight to Chinese influence. Simultaneously, it preserves its relationship with Russia as a source of discounted oil and defense equipment. It deepens engagement with Iran through the port of Chabahar, connecting India to Central Asia via the INSTC while bypassing Pakistan entirely. The result? India was officially designated a friendly country under Iran's Hormuz transit framework. Indian-flagged vessels move through the strait safely even during active hostilities. India buys Russian oil in rupees, invests in Iranian ports, participates in American defense exercises, and chairs the BRICS summit simultaneously. That is what sovereignty looks like in 2026. Not loyalty, leverage. The first act. A 160-kilometer railroad in northern Iran is under construction with Russian financing. When it is complete, it will connect St. Petersburg to Mumbai by land, no canal, no strait, no navy required. A toll booth in the Strait of Hormuz is collecting fees in yuan. A nation producing $20,000 drones is bleeding the defense budget of a nation dependent on $15 million interceptors, and the mathematics do not reverse regardless of how many targets are destroyed in the opening hours of a campaign. A bloc representing 40% of the world's economic output is meeting to build financial infrastructure that does not route through New York. Up to 96% of Russian-Indian trade already bypasses the dollar entirely. That is not a forecast, it is a documented fact. The connections between these developments are available to anyone willing to trace them. Hormuz leads to oil. Oil leads to inflation. Inflation shapes elections. Elections determine policy. Policy, or its absence, loops back to Hormuz. Sanctions accelerated Russia and Iran toward INSTC. The INSTC enables de-dollarization. De-dollarization strengthens BRICS. BRICS provides the diplomatic architecture that makes all of it sustainable. These are not separate threads. They constitute a single integrated system designed to function without the permission of Washington, and the stress test of 2026 has demonstrated that the system works. The world after the Strait of Hormuz crisis will not resemble the world before it. The logistics are different, the payment systems are different, the alliances are different. And the next choke point, the one that controls not oil but silicon, not energy but information processing, not 20% of the world's fuel but 92% of its advanced semiconductors, is already on the map. Hormuz was the first act. Whether anyone in a position to respond is actually prepared for what follows remains, as of this writing, an open question.